I'd like to open 5 by 15 by sincerely acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people, whose ancient oral storytelling practices first steeped this site in unscripted oral narrative. I'd also like to personally thank Gemma Birrell. Working on 5 by 15 with Gemma is always a blast, and this great event that we both love could never, ever have ended up here on the main stage without her. After 2 festivals, 5 by 15's Sydney alumni is impressive, including the riotously funny actor Richard Roxburgh, soulful hip-hop artist and manager Tim Levinson, otherwise known as Earthboy, and the magnetic theatre maker Wesley Enoch, whose spine-tingling traditional welcome song and moving reflections on inheritance left many of us a bit teary last year. No 2 speakers and no 2 evenings are alike, except for one thing. Everyone who does 5 by 15 has a rogue spirit. I'm very honoured to welcome this year's rogues to the stage. This week, writers and audiences are asking how to live, and the work of each of these speakers suggests that at least one part of the answer is with gusto, with unabashed appetite and curiosity. Reading and writing are solitary pursuits, ostensibly taking us inward. Reading, equally, one of the great contradictions and consolations of art is that it demands and rewards openness, both in practice and appreciation. So do please settle in with open eyes, open ears, and open hearts. And as it happens, our first speaker knows a thing or two about open mouths. As he travels the world searching for new taste sensations to add to his formidable arsenal of culinary expertise. Becoming a household name after winning the 2nd series of MasterChef, his cookbooks, newspaper and magazine columns, Destination Flavour SBS series, and even his Twitter feed all afford rich glimpses of his questing, gentle, and readily amused nature. In our house, and I suspect many others, the shorthand for acknowledging his latest adventure boils down to just 2 words: not work. And yet it transpires that he really is the perfect host, quietly, skillfully going to great lengths to put everyone else at ease. Please welcome Adam Liaw, here to talk about food stories, why they're both unendurably boring and absolutely necessary.
I spent my childhood at my grandmother's apron strings as she guided me through the secrets of her kitchen. I vividly remember the smell of roasting duck and the sound of sizzling dumplings as she unravelled all of these small mysteries for me. Those are the memories of my childhood, or at least they would be if anything I just said was even remotely true. But it's not, but you wanted to believe it, didn't you? You know, my grandmother's style of teaching was really mainly about yelling at us. But you never really hear about children being lovingly screamed at by their grandparents. Childhood memories, or particularly the right type of childhood memories, are a really common cliche in the way we talk about food, and chefs are constantly trying to take us back through those memories, notwithstanding that they know nothing about them at all. That's what I want to spend my 15 minutes talking to you about today. The language that we use around food and the psychology of what that means for both the food we're describing and for us as people. I have to be honest, I've never eaten at the Fat Duck, but I can only imagine that the experience is Heston Blumenthal physically restraining you in a chair as he forces you to relive every moment of your childhood from the ages of 3 through till 12. Why are childhood memories so important to chefs? Why do we focus so much on them, and why do we accept them as being important for food? We never really hear about the stories of people who didn't have good childhoods going forward into loving food. My grandmother's style of teaching us to cook may have been yelling, and she may not have been the white-haired happiness fairy that we're all supposed to have, but she was a very loving grandmother, and I love her very much. She lives in Adelaide. Please don't tell her I said anything bad about her. I said in a line in one of my very first cookbooks, the food that we are served as children becomes the food that we crave as adults. And this is the really irritating thing about childhood memories. It's one of the most common cliches that we hear in food. It's boring, it's ubiquitous, it's presumptuous, but actually it's really very true. It's important to have these kind of memories as children, but at the same time, we tend to lose sight of the fact that it's not only important. Why do we put up with these stories that kind of take this grain of truth that childhood memories are important and then twist it and contort it and distort it until we're left with this fallacy that you can only have a positive and healthy relationship with food as an adult if you've had this kind of well-adjusted middle-class childhood to begin with. We don't really hear the stories of children who grow into inmates on death row, that the most commonly requested food back when the US used to take death row requests from inmates for their final meal was a meal at McDonald's. But what we're really left with is, oh my God, Heston, this $40 dessert tastes like a Freddo frog, and now I'm a 7-year-old again, except I'm a 7-year-old who wonders why he just paid $40 for a dessert that tastes like a Freddo frog. I think the answer to why we accept these fallacies or these cliches in the language of food really comes down to 3 main reasons. Firstly, food's become a media animal. It didn't used to be the case. It used to be the case that food was something you shared just with the people in your immediate vicinity, the people that you grew up with, your family and your friends. But now it's on TV 7 nights a week. It's in magazines with smutty pornographic images of cakes that just force us to desire them. And even Instagram has become this kind of grown-up version of Pokemon, where people rush around the restaurants of Sydney trying to collect shots of all of the hot dishes. And that's where the cliche comes in. You see, cliches are where popular media asks you to suspend disbelief, kind of in the same way that Home and Away asks you to suspend disbelief by showing you an image of 2015 Australia as if we'd never gotten rid of the White Australia policy. But even this idea of suspending disbelief is not something that I really agree with. Suspending disbelief implies that you're being asked to forget you're being told a lie. But that's not really what popular media does. Popular media doesn't tell us lies. It's more cunning than that, and we're actually a lot smarter than that. We don't believe lies. What the cliche does is it asks you to forget part of what you already know to be true. Yes, it may be true that some chefs love to work long hours and slave away in fits of creativity to bring you the best possible food that they can lay at your feet. But there are many chefs that are just in it for a job. There are some farmers who want to slave away and work quite literally toiling in the fields to bring you the ultimate potato. But there are many that feel absolutely yoked to what they consider a burden, as being a farmer on the land in Australia can sometimes be. And it kind of brings me to my second point of why food cliches are so important and yet so difficult for us to understand at times. And that's because food is something that's very real. I can hear you saying, yes, Adam, I know this. I'm familiar with food. I eat it just about every day. But you see, popular media has taken food into something that we now crave as a form of expression. It's not just food anymore. You never read a food review saying, there was a great nutritional balance in the meal and I didn't feel hungry at the end of it, 5 out of 5 stars. But food is now a form of expression in the same way that art might be, or literature, or music, or theatre. But it's very different from those because it is this holistic sensory experience. Yes, we hear music and we see and hear theatre, but with food, we taste it quite obviously, but we also feel it, we see it being cooked, we see it on the plate, we hear it being cooked, we smell it. And that kind of multiple data point for food means that it's far less open to interpretation. It's not so much the form of expression that's lacking when we talk about food. When a chef wants to access, I guess, a feeling of nostalgia or comfort, what we describe that as is taking you back to your childhood. When a musician or an artist wants to do the same thing, we might describe their work as playful or innocent. And it's really the same thing. It's just different words that we're using to describe it. We shouldn't look down at the form of expression as being cliched. What we should really understand is that as human beings, our range of emotions are actually quite limited. We all feel the same things. The diversity that we see in this auditorium is really what brings us together as people. We have the same emotions, we want to feel the same things, we want to feel loved, we want to feel cared for, and we want that form of expression reflected back to us in our art. Third point, food is this connection between biology and psychology. Yes, food is a biological imperative, we need it, but we also want to feel excited by it. And it's quite, I'll illustrate this through the example of stock. And to illustrate stock, we kind of have to talk about umami. Quick show of hands, who knows what umami is? Okay, umami is a taste. It's a taste just like saltiness or sweetness or bitterness or sourness. It's something chemical that we can taste in our mouths. That's sodium chloride, axon receptors, we taste that as being salty. Glucose axon receptors, we taste that as being sweet. Umami, axon receptors. And what it actually is, without going too far into it, is a taste of deliciousness. It's what makes things taste good. It's found in all the foods that we consider to be tasty foods: Parmesan cheese, fermented foods like wine, vanilla, toasted bread, roasted meats. All of those things are very, very high in umami. And it's also responsible for a lot of the flavor combinations that we might consider classical flavor combinations in food. When you start to put two umami-rich foods together, the result is this kind of 1 + 1 = 3 equation where the taste of it is greater than the sum of the parts. So just say you have Parmesan cheese or tomato together, you put them into one dish, and you get the basis of Italian food. You put katsuobushi, dried bonito flakes, and kombu together in Japanese food, and you get ichiban dashi, the Japanese stock. Now, when you apply umami to stock, what's really interesting is that the concentrations of umami, whether it's in a beef consommé in France or an ichiban dashi in Japan or a bone broth in China, all tend to be about the same. They've developed completely independently, but they all have around the same concentrations, the same micrograms per mil of these umami-rich substances. Now, in nature, where do we find that concentration of umami-rich substances? In the most part, the most common source of umami at that concentration of a standard chicken stock is in human breast milk. So we are quite literally hard-coded with an appreciation of good food from birth. And as a cookbook author, I find this connection between food and psychology something that's absolutely fascinating. People tend to think of cookbooks as this kind of textbook or instructional manual for how to make a dish, but I see them as psychological and aspirational as any work of fiction might be. When I write a cookbook, I start by tending to ask myself a very simple question: what do I want this cookbook to achieve? And it may be something as simple as, I would like to encourage people to cook more Asian food. And so how do I communicate without just saying the words, cook more Asian food? One-word book, one-sentence book, thank you very much, I'm done. But I try to write it in a way that's not an imperative. I don't say, you must do this, you should do this is the way to do this. I try to show people what I do, and I say, I make this dish, this is how I make it, maybe you might want to try it too. But of course, cookbooks aren't just literal, they're visual as well. And so we have as many visual cliches as we do literal cliches when we come together with cookbooks. If you've seen an Asian cookbook, you're probably familiar with a lot of them. A pair of chopsticks sitting over a rice bowl, the color of red all the time, a torn up piece of a Chinese newspaper from 1984. And these are there for a very specific purpose. What they're trying to say is, here's something exotic, here's something from the Far East, isn't that fantastic? But for me, it's the exact opposite message than what I'm trying to convey. I'm trying to say, here's something familiar, here's something that you can do. And so we have a real rule when we're styling my cookbooks that you'll never see a chopstick, you'll never see anything overtly Asian in the styling. If there is a dish from a Hong Kong barbecue, we'll make that look as if it's just come off an Australian barbecue. And that tends to get a really good response. But these kind of cliches show us the way an individual might feel, but they also show us the way that we may feel as a society at large. You're probably familiar, if you've picked up a food magazine or any type of food book recently, of this kind of rustic aesthetic that we find really attractive here in Australia. An old wooden board, a piece of vintage crockery, and some ingredients kind of scattered around. And the message that that's trying to send is, we have just thrown this meal together. It's something that I just knocked up in a few minutes, but actually it's full of soul and tradition and culture. That's all very good for us, but it becomes interesting when you think that that rustic aesthetic is something that is most popular in countries like Australia and the United States, New World countries where we tend to have this inherent insecurity that we don't have enough culture or enough tradition to justify a food culture here. If you look at a food magazine from Japan or France or Italy or Korea, you'll find that their design and their style is very much modern and fresh and clean because that's what they look for in their food. Of course, food and the messaging around food can give you an insight into the real story that people are trying to tell. Now, I don't mind if any of you are trying to eradicate sugar or gluten or any foods from the modern era from your life. That is your own choice. But I find it very interesting that a lot of these diets or fad diets or exclusion diets tend to have messaging that is consistent, regardless of what the nutrition of it may be. They tend to have three main points to them, and they are, this is the way to eat, this is the way humans were meant to eat, and anyone who's trying to tell you that this is wrong is lying to you. Or to put it another way, I am the Lord your God, I am your Father and Creator, and thou shalt have no other gods but me. Now, if the way that you are trying to convey your scientific message is borrowing from the faith of organized religion, I think we're moving slightly away from nutritional value. Now, I should probably go because I'm out of time. I have 30 seconds left. And I don't want to let anyone off the hook when we talk about cliches in food and cliches in writing, but I think it's really important to know that it's not just a lazy food writer or a lazy author, and it's not just an imaginative TV producer that may be coming up with these cliches. These cliches are there for a reason, and they tell us an awful lot about who we are, what makes our food respond to who we are, and really what makes us human. Thank you.
I didn't actually know until tonight that my suspicion of organised religion was food-based. It makes so much sense now. Our next speaker writes true blockbusters, a prolific author who created a character nearly 25 years ago that has prevailed and lived to investigate another crime over the course of, I think we're at 20 novels in this series alone. I'm speaking, of course, of the Harry Bosch LAPD detective series, with the titular character aging in real time alongside his global fan base, reflecting our rapidly changing times back to us. There's something so very affecting about reaching the twilight of Harry's career in the latest novel, The Burning Room. What will Harry do next? Australian fans can console themselves with the forthcoming TV series, which SBS will be screening from July. Tonight, Harry's creator is here to share with us the chance sequence of events that started it all. Please welcome Michael Connelly with Life Sentence.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here tonight. Before I start, I just want to say I'm very lucky. One of the perks, I guess, that comes with my job is I get to go to a lot of, I get to travel the world. I go to a lot of festivals, book festivals, author festivals. And you got a really good one here, and so you should really celebrate it and support it. I think the Sydney Writers Festival is the best I've been to because of its location, its diversity, the camaraderie of the writers and readers that come here, the support of the publishers, and I'm very honored to have been invited, and I thank the festival for inviting me and bringing me here. I also thank my publisher, Allen and Unwin. It's really weird. I'm working on, I think it's my 27th novel, and so I make my living making it up, and then they told me I had to come out and tell a true story. And it feels like I've been hiding behind false stories for most of my adult life. And so I've been waffling on what to tell because I wasn't sure what to tell, all week. And I'm really happy the lights are so bright, I think I'm talking to myself. Anyway, I thought I'd tell a story. I just called it this today when I decided this is what I'd tell it. My moment of clarity. It wasn't the moment I knew I wanted to be the writer, but it was the moment I knew how to write, or I knew what I needed to do to write. I guess it was kind of late. I decided when I was 19 years old that I wanted to be a writer. Not only that, but more specifically, I wanted to be a crime writer because that was what I loved to read. And that's what I wanted to do, and I thought there were ways of taking that form to greater dimensions, and it was books that had that greater dimension that inspired me to want to be a crime writer. So that was when I was 19, and then when I was 35, that was when I first held a book I had written in my hand. So a lot had happened in those 16 years. And this was a moment that, if it had not happened to me, I was sure I wouldn't be standing here tonight, which at the moment doesn't seem like such a bad thing. But when I just made that decision, I wanted to be a crime writer. I huddled with my parents and told them, revealed this to them, and we came up with a plan or an idea that might lead to the moment that I would be able to take a shot at that. And that was to go into journalism and get a press pass and get to crime scenes, hang out in police stations, hang out in criminal courtrooms, and I'd be able to observe the world that I wanted to write in fiction. And so I did that, and I did that for 14 years. And all the while I was doing it, I was on my own time writing fiction. There were some people who read my stories who thought I was writing fiction at the newspaper, but that I wasn't. I was really separating these lives, and at night I would write, and on weekends I would write. And over time, I wrote my first novel, and I was not set in Los Angeles as all my books are now. I was actually writing for my hometown paper in South Florida, a state all the way 3,000 miles away from California. And it was based somewhat on a true story that I had written about as a reporter. And I worked on it for a couple years, and when it was done, I read it, and I decided that no other person should ever read that story. And I put it in a drawer, and later I put it in a box, and it somehow has disappeared, and that's really what it deserved. But it was, I wasn't bereft, I wasn't depressed. It was all part of the learning process. And I started it again. And I started another one, another story based on something I had written as a reporter about a kid who faked his kidnapping and the detective who figured it out. And I wrote a novel based on that over about 2 more years. And when I read that, it was a lot better than the first one, but it also should not have been read by anyone else, not even my mother, and because she wanted to read it, but I wouldn't let her read it. And it got the same fate. And that was when I kind of went through my winter of discontent, and I had to try to figure out what I was missing. And I had good stories in these books, good framework of stories. And I'm a voracious reader of crime fiction, and I was comparing it to stuff that was being published and stuff that I loved and stuff that I didn't love even. And I just knew it was missing something. And I didn't know what it was. And, so I went through and it had taken a lot of time, and I was married. We were wanting to have a family, but I knew I couldn't have a kid, help raise a kid, while I was spending 4 or 5 nights a week writing and 1 day on the weekend. Even though I was living in the same house as my wife, it was like we had 1 day a week together. And so it was a big sacrifice. And so I really had to weigh, do I keep doing this? Maybe I'm not the person who should be writing novels. And this is a very interesting job I have anyway, so maybe that's what it should be. And so I took some time off from writing fiction as I was thinking about all this. And on my job, I was the crime reporter for a kind of a small town, medium-sized town, about 300,000 people lived in it. And I had grown up there, and I knew a lot of people and was very comfortable. And I got this opportunity to spend a week with the homicide squad. They were having a very busy year. This was in the 80s. This is when all the cocaine was flooding into Miami and violence was spreading through the state of Florida. And we were just an hour's ride north of Miami, so we got our fair share of violence in the town I grew up in. It's called Fort Lauderdale. And so the homicides were way up. And that was a news story. And went in and lobbied the police chief to let me inside the homicide squad to see how they work. And I would write a long magazine story for the Sunday magazine of the paper. And I got that approved. And, this was in the 80s. There weren't cell phones. There was not the same kind of technology involved in media or law enforcement as there is today, obviously. So I was given a pager, and the head of the squad was a guy named, improbably enough, Sergeant Hurt. And my instructions were you would have full access, but you were to be attached at the hip to Sergeant Hurt so you don't mess up any crime scenes, you don't get in the way. And it will last 7 days, exactly 7 days. And if there's no murders, that's too bad. But if there are murders, you'll get to see them. You'll get to see the investigations. And so I did that, and it started Sunday to Saturday. And on Sunday afternoon, I'm watching football, American football, and the pager goes off, and I'm called to a scene, and I call up Sergeant Hurt, and he says, yeah, we have a murder. Gives me the address. He says, wear old clothes, and then he hangs up on me. And then, so I show up at the murder scene, and it's somebody who's been found murdered in his apartment, and he's been there about a week. And that's why he wanted me to wear old clothes, because you never get the smell out of your clothes, which is what I learned that day. And as we go in there, Sergeant Hurt, who wasn't really happy that I was there, but the police chief made him take me on, whispered in my ear, he said that of course, that all smell is particulate. You're smelling, what creates the sense of smell is microscopic particulates hitting your nasal passages. So if you smell a dead body, you're breathing a dead body, which was a great thing to hear as I was going in. And so I got to watch a crime scene being worked and the interactions between detectives and so forth. And at one point, when it was safe enough, or okay, I guess you'd say, to go up to the body, Sergeant Hurt went up to the body. He wore glasses, and he squatted down next to the body like this and was looking at it. And he took off his glasses, and he put them in his mouth like this. And he was just looking at it. He didn't say anything to anyone, and then he eventually got up. And so I, took furious notes, and I was also thinking this could be useful if I ever write a third novel, or attempt to, what I'm seeing. And that was great. And then 2 nights later, in the middle of the night, my pager goes off again, and I call Sergeant Hurt and says, we have another one. And this was a person who had just come out of a bar. Bar closed at 2 a.m., and he left the bar at closing time and was walking to his car, and someone drove by and shot him. And so we had an outdoor crime scene, and we were there for a long time, all through the night. And at one point, when it was okay and the forensics had cleared out, Sergeant Hurt went up to the body and looked at it, and he put his glasses in his mouth like this. So finally, 2 days later, the pager goes off again, and there's another murder. So it's weird. I mean, that's a sad thing. Murders are bad, and it's awful for society, but I was so lucky. There were 3 murders on the week I was there. And this guy was someone who was shot in his car, and people had tried to help him and save him, and they pulled him out of his car, so he was on the ground with his feet still in the car when he died. And we did the same thing, and at some point, Sergeant Hurt, like that. And so eventually, at that scene, I said, what are you doing, praying? Are you promising this person that you're going to find out who did it? What's that all about? And he said, the police chief said I had to have you on this week-long thing, but I don't have to tell you anything about that. And he walked away. He wouldn't tell me what that was about. And so it was, I was a reporter for 14 years, and those 7 days were the best of my whole career, the most informative, the most meaningful. And I started relationships with 4 or 5 homicide detectives, and we were there when they were calling their kids and saying, "I'm not going to get home." And I got a real idea of what it's like to do that job, and it certainly has informed all the work I've done since. But on the last day, on Saturday, I sat in Sergeant Hurt's office, and I was just kind of wrapping stuff up. Of the 3 murders, they solved 2 during the week, and one, I check on it every now and then, is the guy who came out of the bar. It's never been solved. But they got 2 out of 3, which was not bad considering all that was going on those days. And so anyway, I'm sitting in his office, and I always remember, oddly enough, he had this framed photo of 2 hands that had been severed, and they were in a crime scene, and for some reason he framed them and put them on his wall. And they were kind of behind him, so like if you looked up from him, it's like, oh, that's weird. But anyway, 3 of those days we had worked through the night, and no one got any sleep. And at some point, Sergeant Hurt took off his glasses. He's sitting behind his desk and throws them on his desk so he can go like this and wipe his eyes. And then I saw in this, the hard plastic of the earpiece, there was a really deep groove that his teeth had made. And I realized that when he was having that moment of communing with the body, his jaws were clenched so tight they were cutting into the hard plastic of his glasses. And all at once I knew that's what I didn't have in my novels. This moment or this aspect of what connects a person with their mission, with their job. It said so much about what the job meant to him, what the job did to him. It said so much about his dedication, his relentlessness. And I do think there was a bit of a prayer and a bit of a promise in what he was doing. And all that while I'm sitting there, and I'm as exhausted as him, I kind of knew I'm going to try a 3rd novel, and I'm going to find a way of getting Sergeant Hurt's glasses into that novel. And that became the novel where Harry Bosch was born, and it got published, and the first one to read it was my mother. Thank you very much.
What an incredible detail. Thank you, Michael. Makes me wonder as well how many murders he had attended that the groove was so deep. Sydney natives are born with a sense that this place is positively lousy with lawbreakers. Some cultivate affection for Sydney's Sin City reputation, while many more assume corruption is so endemic. The construction of each new eyesore is greeted with knowing jeers about brown paper bags crowded with cash. But nothing prepared Sydney for the grubby paws of Eddie Obeid, a man who left no pie unplugged. There is perhaps no one outside the family itself more associated with his downfall than our next speaker, the tenacious thoroughbred of multi-award-winning Australian journalism and co-author of the clear-eyed cautionary tale, He Who Must Be Obeyed. As a senior reporter on the Sydney Morning Herald, she has said it is her job not to turn away, and she holds firm with intelligence and style despite death threats, abuse, and moments of acute professional discomfort. Joining 5x15 to share the art of lie detection in journalism, please welcome Obeid buster Kate McClymont.
Thank you all very much, and I'd like to take this opportunity also to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Obeid family. So, I've come here tonight to talk to you about journalism and the art of lie detection. Now, a very famous British editor, Max Hastings, when he was starting off as a young journalist, got some words of advice, and it was about politicians, and he was told, never forget, they lie, they lie, they lie. and how right he was. Now, during my perfection of my art of lie detection, I've divided politicians into two different categories. Now, the first category, when you ask them a question, they don't look at you, they look away, they obfuscate, they sweat, they're indirect in their answers. They're just the fibbers. It's the ones that look you dead in the eye and without a moment's hesitation say, that is not true. You know, they just aren't a liar. They are almost a pathological liar. And the reason they can look you dead in the eye and lie to you is exactly the same quality that has allowed them to do the corrupt activities that they have been doing in the first place. These people, they sleep well at night. They don't think they have done anything wrong. They think that we are merely stupid people who don't appreciate their efforts. Now, of all my favourite liars, and I'll mention my dear friend, he who must be obeyed, but I'm leaving him aside for a moment. My two favourite liars have to be those jolly chaps from the Health Services Union, Michael Williamson and Craig Thompson. Now, you might recall that Craig Thompson went on to be a federal Labor politician. And during his time as a Labor politician, Fairfax Media uncovered the fact that Craig Thompson, while a union official, had spent a vast amount of money. He'd got cash advances from the ATM. He'd spent money on hookers. He'd gone on trips. Now, all of this was something that you would think Craig would have felt momentarily embarrassed and fessed up. But no, Craig Thompson looked you in the eye and said, I did not do that. And I wasn't the only one he did this to. You might recall that Channel 9's Laurie Oakes had Craig Thompson on national TV. And at one stage, he actually said to Craig, don't you understand? You are like the man that you're standing over the body. In one hand you have a gun, in the other you have a dagger, and you're saying, it's not me. Now, what he was referring to was that in Craig's world, there seemed to be a criminal mastermind at foot. Now, the criminal mastermind would drive to Craig's house on the Central Coast. He would break in, he would steal Craig's mobile phone, his credit card, his license. He would then go on a spree at brothels, and then he would put them back so that Craig didn't even know they were missing. What a genius! And not only that, when Craig had the misfortune of staying in Melbourne, and that is a misfortune, we all know that, when Craig is staying in Melbourne, someone is breaking into his hotel room. They are ringing agencies such as Young Blondes and misbehaving while Craig's not looking. And then when he goes to pay the credit card bill, he doesn't seem to notice this criminal mastermind is doing these things. I mean, really. But Craig was nothing compared to the master. Now, the master was Michael Williamson. Now, I have a tiny confession to make here. I got a call from a member of the public who said, listen, have a break from Craig Thompson. You should be looking at Michael Williamson. And I said, who's he? And he said, he's the head of the Health Services Union, and he's the national president of the Labor Party. And he said, as far as I know, union bosses get about $150,000 a year. Now, Michael Williamson, on his $150,000, has got 5 children at private schools. He and his wife drive top of the range Mercedes. When they go on their overseas travels, they fly first class, and his wife doesn't work. And the most galling thing for my caller was the fact that the Williamsons always outbid them at the school auction. As far as they were concerned, that was the clincher. Anyway, I thought, well, that's as good a reason as any to have a look at the Williamsons. Anyway, when I started looking, I could not believe what I found. This guy was a rolled gold fraudster. He was the real deal. There was almost no aspect of the Health Services Union that he had not plundered. And although, there's a lot of things that are well known, some of the minor things that he got up to was, for instance, how many of you have been mugged at an ATM machine? Well, poor Mr. Williamson, 3 times. He just happened to have got money out of the ATM and someone comes along and steals it. And there he is with his briefcase full of Health Services Union cash. Someone steals it. But really tragically were the break-ins at his union office. Twice the safe got broken into, thousands of dollars were stolen. Now, on the second occasion, the security guards told me that there was only one key card that had been used to get into the Health Services Union that night. Yes, you've got it. It was Michael Williamson's. But when the security guard said to him, would he like to call the police so they could investigate? No need. No need. So this week, when Michael Williamson's lawyers were announcing that they were lodging an appeal against the severity of his jail term, he got 5 years jail, and they said that the judge had overstated the seriousness of his offences. It really annoyed me because people like Michael Williamson, they come before the judge and they say that they're terribly sorry. They're only terribly sorry they got caught. They're not really terribly sorry. And, I look back and I think, last September, I was down at the Downing Centre and I was sitting there taking notes, and about 3 feet away was Pat Romano, the General Manager of Burwood Council. And because of my articles, poor Pat was about to go off to jail. So he was sitting there holding his wife's hand, sobbing, and then he got in the witness box and he was crying, saying this is all terrible. He was dreadfully sorry. Even I momentarily felt sorry for him. And then I almost had to give myself a bit of a slap and recall that Pat Romano, like many people I have come to know, there's there is a criminal tick. Once someone says to me, I'm being really, really honest with you, I know they are lying. And so was the case with Pat Romano. So I recall that one of the employees at the council had come to me and said that Pat Romano, the general manager, who's on a salary of about $300,000 a year, I might add, had got council staff to be secretly doing the renovations on his investment properties. Not just that, Pat had got them to build him a new driveway, all with council resources, all on council time. And when I rang Pat up to put this to him, without any hesitation, he said to me, "Oh dear," he said, "I'm being totally honest with you here." He said, "I never knew that." And I thought, totally honest, yeah, right. And not only that, as if that wasn't bad lying to me, he then said about these poor council workers, "I'm going to have to investigate them for undertaking secondary employment without letting me know." Secondary employment on his own property. I love that. Anyway, so ICAC started investigating Pat Romano after my stories, and they found even more fabulous things, such as the fact that Pat had used $45,000 of council's money hiring private detectives to spy on his wife. He thought wrongly that his wife was having an affair. So he hires the council to, gets the council to pay for investigators. When they come up empty-handed, that still wasn't enough. Pat then billed the council $650 for photoshopping, because what he did was he got surveillance footage of his wife, he got surveillance footage of his work colleagues, the work colleague that he thought was having an affair. He blended them together so they appeared they were sitting on a park bench, and then he very kindly, anonymously posted the photoshopped piece of work to the poor hapless, work colleague, sent it to his wife and said, "Home wrecker." So as Pat is, sobbing in the witness box, I thought, no, I don't need to feel sorry for you. But before you think that it's only Labor types who embark upon these criminal activities, I'd like to remind you of last year's passing parade of Liberals who appeared at ICAC. And they were trying to explain their ever-ingenious methods of disguising banned donations from developers. So in the witness box, we had Tim Owen. Now, Tim Owen was the Liberal candidate for the seat of Newcastle. He was a former Air Commodore in the RAAF. He comes in the witness box. He's got his beautiful navy suit. They all have their Order of Australia pinned to their lapel, I might add. So he sits there and he is being asked about a $10,000 donation he got from developer Jeff McCloy. Now, when I say Jeff McCloy, think of Mr. Newcastle. Jeff McCloy was the developer's developer, and in fact, he went on to be Lord Mayor. So here is Tim Owen saying, yes, look, I was in Jeff McCloy's Bentley when I received the money. Well, what did he say to you? And he said to council assisting, he said, gee, I can't actually remember the gist of it, to be honest. To be honest, I knew he was lying. As soon as you say that, you are lying. Well, of course, he was lying. So the next day, he thinks he's home and hosed. So all he has to do is just fob off a couple of questions being bowled up to him by, witnesses, barristers, and he's out of there. He doesn't even bother wearing a tie. He's got the open neck shirt, still got the Order of Australia, though. Anyway, the very first question of the day, his life is over as he knows it, because it was Jeff McCloy's barrister who asked him the relatively simple question, when did you last see my client, Mr. McCloy? Well, said Tim Owen, oh, gee, a couple of weeks ago, a couple of days ago. To be honest, I can't really remember. And I think, oh my God, your fate is sealed. So then the barrister said, well, would it surprise you that you only saw my client 2 days ago? And not only that, you tried to get him to lie about the $10,000 that he gave you. And with that, his life was over. He had to resign from Parliament, and off he rode with his little Order of Australia into the distance. Which brings us to his colleague, Andrew Cornwall. Now, Andrew Cornwall was the local vet in Charlestown, and like Tim Owen, he was also running for a Liberal seat. Now, here we are, it's leading up to Christmas, December 2010. He's operating, in his Charleston veterinary surgery. He's got his scrubs on when the veterinary nurse comes in and says, there's someone here to see you, a Mr. McCloy. Well, he's out there so fast, he's in the Bentley, he's taking the $10,000. I mean, I'm sorry, but you don't need to be a political expert to know it is not a good look for a candidate to be in a Bentley taking $10,000 in a brown paper bag from a developer. But funnily enough, after we wrote this story, I had so many calls from readers demanding to know what was the fate of the poor anaesthetised pooch on the table. And I had to confess, we never did find out what happened to the dog. But anyway, as if it wasn't enough accepting one lot of $10,000, no, our vet had to go and get more. So as I said, it's Christmas time, and Andrew Cornwall, as he tells ICAC, he is driving around the district in his Subaru, his boot is stocked with unwanted gifts. This is a very good lesson about the dangers of re-gifting. So one of the things he says he has in the boot is a work of that renowned artist, Rex Newell. We'll come to Rex Newell in a moment. But anyway, the counsel assisting says to him, how is it that property developer Hilton Grujon, and I love that, it's actually spelt Grudgion, but Grujon has a much nicer tone to it. So here he is, and counsel assisting says to him, how is it that Mr. Grujon happens to get a Rex Newell artwork and, say, not a leg of lamb? And the vet says to him, it was just dumb luck, to be honest. He was the last person. And I thought, right, they've got you. To be honest, we know you're not being honest. Now, as it turned out, it was a completely sham transaction. It was just a way to get $10,000. So the painting had never been in the boot. And in fact, when Andrew Cornwall and his wife were asked to describe the painting, one said, oh, it was a farmhouse. The other one said, oh, it was a lovely homestead with a jacaranda tree. It was a boat. Like, they weren't even close. It was a boat. Now, I have to say, no offence to Rex Newell, but the fact that Hilton Grujon thought that this amazing piece of work was so fabulous, he couldn't accept it as a gift, perish the thought. No, he had to pay $10,000 for it. So a Rex Newell work, I think the average price is $255. Sadly, there was one occasion when one of his works only raised $23. But there was a high point in 2007 when one of the works went for $1,400. But as you can see, $10,000, what a miracle. Now, even though Hilton Grujon was obviously a great patron of the arts, he donated the work to Maitland Hospital. Now, it saddens me to say that at the charity auction for Maitland Hospital, there was not a bid for the Rex Newell work. But there is a good ending to this story. At the height of the ICAC investigation last year, when the aforesaid boat, jacaranda, homestead had become, the key exhibit in the inquiry, Maitland Hospital put the painting on eBay and it fetched $8,200. So that was a happy outcome. Now, I just want you to go away today with just one thing firmly in your mind. When a politician looks you in the eye and says, I'm being really, really honest, you know they really, really aren't. So thank you very much.
As hysterical as that was, at a certain point your blood also starts to boil a little bit, doesn't it? Good on Maitland Hospital, and stay away from those school auctions. Our next speaker is a rapper and poet whose debut novel, Here Come the Dogs, was longlisted for this year's Miles Franklin Award. Low-lying tension runs through this novel like hot tar. My guts kept twisting as three young male protagonists kept careening to the edge of the abyss and back. This heartbreaking trio made me think of line-caught fish bending and writhing together on the bottom of a riverboat, beautiful and gutsy, fighting for freedom, for life, despite limited options for escape. I caught my breath so many times, eyes smarting while I clutched the open book and whispered to them in turn, don't do it. Please be okay and go with her. Please welcome a writer of enormous visceral power, Omar Musa, to the river.
Hello. Hello, thank you for having me here with such a great lineup. As you can see, I've bent the rules a little bit. You're supposed to speak off the cuff. I've got some cheat notes. I'm feeling a little bit like a member of the high school debating team with these. So, chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, adjudicators, let me tell you my story. Is it cool if I tell you a story, Sydney? Can you make a little bit of noise? Oh, yeah, good. I need to ease up here. Okay, so when I was young, I could smell the river from my bedroom window. It was as if it had uncoiled its muscular brown body and was moving its silent force through the hot air towards me. Sometimes, rain comes down the steep slopes of the Gurok Ranges and the Tinderi Mountains, feeding the river, engorging it so that it rises dark and steady, taking hold of the riverbanks and the roads, up, over the bridge leading into Oaks Estate, up, over the Low Morisset Bridge, up, flattening out the willows and the blackberry bushes, smelling like wood rot and redfin, sounding like thunder and threat, promise and a lost past. The river, named for its clear waters, axe country, flint country, water gum, tea tree, hickory country, brolga, wallaroo, opossum skin, corroboree country, where later the pitsaw and adze built huts of hardwood and stringy bark, where nuns tiptoed over stones from one bank to the other, only a few miles from where Austrians and Germans were interned during World War I. The river, where teenagers suck, smoke and fuck in Fairmonts and Falcons, where dudes with Aussie pride tats on the backs of their hands sip without pride on Woodstock cans. Once, in the river's braided body, there were Murray cod, Macquarie perch, gold and silver, so numerous that Europeans first named it the Fish River, so numerous that back in the early days, floods scattered fish all over the streets of Queanbeyan. It was as if pieces of the moon had fallen, dancing and bending over the dusty macadam. You won't find many Murray cod in the Queanbeyan River anymore. Now, young fellas named Corey and Nathan and Reese catch 4-kilo carp with corn cobs on running sinker rigs. Tailings from the mine in Captain's Flat ruined the waters long ago, full as they are of trolleys and sometimes bodies, floating with suburban jellyfish, discarded rubber remnants of midnight follies. When I was a child, my father warned me about the river because tiger snakes bit children and dogs there. When I was a child, an old blackfella saved me from drowning, hoisting me up with strong tobacco-scented hands in my armpits. When I was 15, there was a family who lived in the flat beneath us. Some might call them battlers, whose atlas extended only as far as the south coast of New South Wales, or maybe the fringes of Western Sydney, but for the most part, our town was their whole world. 2 parents, not too many teeth between them, and a second-hand car that people kept setting on fire in unexplained midnight raids. The mother, a childminder. The father, skinny but strong from putting up fences. 2 kids, half my age, a boy and a girl. Their mother used to write poetry and make her own storybooks for them, drawing them and binding them and stapling them herself. Their father would look at her with billion-watt pride and say, "Well, isn't that something?" Before they came to the flats, they had lived in a house on a hill on the other side of town. It wasn't a nice house, but a house bigger than this, with an auntie and her husband. They had left the house in a hurry. And since the kids didn't seem to have any friends, and since I was an only child, every day after school, I used to shrug my bag off and play soccer with them. We would turn the fence into a goalpost. I would show them how to chip the ball, how to juggle it on the laces and catch it behind your head, how to put a bit of curl on it by hitting it with the outside of your foot. The little girl's name was Renee, breathless and scab-kneed, blonde with river-dark eyes, and the type of naivety and imagination this world is hell-bent on destroying. She had inherited her mother's love for drawing, and sometimes she drew unicorns and castles in her school books. One day, out of the blue, Renee told me the reason they had left the old house on the hill. Her uncle-in-law, who they were living with, had started coming down into her room every night, down, down, down. When at last Renee had told her mother, she confronted the man, and the whole family got kicked out of the house. "Liar," he yelled, "liar." "But I'm only 8, Renee said to me. "How can I be a liar?" I went down to the river that day, and I said a prayer for little Renee. I prayed that she would be okay, floating downstream on the dreamlike tides. And then I said a prayer for myself, a nerdy little bastard with glasses and hair parted. And in the spot I stood, I buried a time capsule, a message in a bottle, with all my dreams written on loose leaf, that one day someone might hear me, that one day I might escape my father, that one day I might build a raft of words and float away. It was the same spot my father used to read the Quran for hours, then go amongst the drunkards and drug addicts, speaking to them of the right path, ignoring the crooked tremors in his own heart. My father was born in Borneo, in a logging camp by the banks of the Kinabatangan River. The Kinabatangan, seemingly named the Father River, with all its offspring tributaries. Orangutan country, kingfisher country, saltwater crocodile, elephant, rhinoceros country, where the northeast monsoon lashes the landscape, feeding it until it becomes the perfect floodplain, where proboscis monkeys with those long noses belly flop into the water, where loggers and oil palm plantations have ruined the upper reaches, where once a decapitated elephant's head floated down the river. O mighty Kinabatangan, once the only highway connecting longhouses and centres of trade. I saw my father's birth certificate once, old paper, which my grandmother had placed in plastic and stitched around the edges to guard against the humid air. The British official who had stamped the document had spelt my grandmother's name wrong. Was it because she was illiterate and couldn't convey it to him properly? Or was it that his ears hadn't yet shaped themselves around the vowels and consonants of the Malay language? I imagine him sweating against the heat, living in what he imagined to be a far outpost of the British Empire, seeing yet another native woman coming to him with her offspring and simply not caring enough to ask her a second time. But maybe I'm wrong. I imagine my father growing up, charming and moody, wandering the streets of Sandakan, wishing to escape his stepfather, shelling prawns for the Japanese and hoping one day he might build a raft of words and float away. Because the river is not just one story, it is stories within stories that lead to others still. It is depths unfathomable, and it lends itself easily to metaphor. As Borges says, this concrete word made by sailors and fishermen has been transformed to stand for something else by the alchemy of poetry. As he says, Tennyson speaks of time as a river flowing in the middle of the night. Heraclitus famously said that no man steps down twice to the same river because it's not the same river and he is not the same man. And then there's this beauty from Jorge Manrique. Nuestras vidas son los ríos que van a dar en la mar, que es el morir. Our lives are the rivers that flow into that sea, death. Every city I land in, I go to the river. When my grandmother died in Australia, I was living in London, and I went to the Thames. My lovers, yes, their bodies and their hair are like rivers. This liquor that drowns me all too often is a river. And of course, I am the river, unrelenting, brown, long of memory, carrier of song. The mirror we call a river shows us our true face, but each to each a different one. Every mask we wear is cast off when we go to the bank. We are able to step forward from behind ourselves and truly be. O memory of memories, poem of poems, secrets and illuminations, complex and eternal, generation to generation. If the river were ever to die, there will be dust, and there will be bones, and there will be drought, and the end of all things. Recently, it's getting a bit grandiose there. Recently, after a long trip away, I returned home to Queanbeyan, and of course, I went to the riverbank. I went to its edge, and I began to dig. I dug with my hands. My nails began to splinter and bleed. They broke. I kept digging, looking upwards to where the willows once were and the black swans remain, where people still leave the burning, blazing wrecks of joy-ridden cars. I kept digging until I hit stone, and I realized that the time capsule was no longer there. Maybe someone had dug it up. Maybe I was digging in the wrong spot. Maybe flood had dislodged it. On the way home, I went to one of those coffee chains, you know, those ones with the lattes that are really shitty, but you drink them just anyway because you're in it for the drugs. And I was served by a young lady there, and she looked familiar to me. She was breathless and blonde with river-dark eyes. She didn't recognize me, but I asked how she was going anyway. She didn't hold back. She let her words break the levee, and they poured from her. She said that times had been tough and brutal and threadbare, that she had met men who prayed with clenched fists, and that at times she thought she had lost it all. But now she worked hard. She drew pictures from time to time. She was doing okay and had managed to find a little peace floating downstream on the dreamlike tides. Thank you. Thank you.
He's something else, isn't he? The whole novel's like that. It's just so sensory. If music is a language, and of course it is, then our final speaker is surely one of Australia's foremost storytellers. His role as lead violinist and artistic director of the Australian Chamber Orchestra undoubtedly helped revolutionise the possibilities for string symphonies and 21st century arrangements around the world. He has spoken of Vivaldi's Four Seasons collection of concertos as a contest between harmony and invention, and there seems no more fitting description of the ACO itself. Under his stewardship, the ACO engages ideas, individuals, the sweeping force of history, the chaos of life, poetry and politics in its hunger for the sublime. The ACO celebrates its 40th birthday this year, and tonight he is surely the icing on our cake. A national living treasure and officer of the Order of Australia. This is certainly no ordinary... Don't think it's on his lapel, though. This is certainly no ordinary musician, and he's here to tell tale of no ordinary violin. Please welcome Richard Tognetti with 1943, Del Jesu and Thomas Jefferson.
Well, there's nothing like a good build-up for a big letdown. And actually, that's nothing compared to time is running out, isn't it? But I've got to unpack this thing because this is what I'm talking about. But there's nothing like having a son, 12-year-old son, telling you just as you go on, geez, the others were really good. And it gets worse. And you've got to be funny. And here I am talking about a violin. So this is the Caritas. It's nicknamed the Caritas, and time is running out, I do know, but I do have to unpack this thing because I'm going to play it a little bit. But I'm going to tell you as much as I can about it and the history of the violin in as little time as I've been given, because I've also been asked to play. So those of you who aren't designers would find it maybe hard, like I do, to identify a name, a household name of a chair maker. I mean, some of you might say, you know, Arne Jacobsen from Denmark, or Philip Stark, Adalva Aalto of Finland, or Australia's own Mark Newson. But it's not a household name, the chair maker. But when you get to violins, Stradivari, or Stradivarius, is. He was born in 1644 and died in 1737, if you quickly do the maths, and if I've done it right, 93, which was no mean age for a 17th into 18th century gentleman. Guarneri del Gesù, on the other hand, and I think it says that I meant to talk about the lawless nature of it. Well, let me extend it to licentious. The lawlessness comes from a myth. Guarneri del Gesù, of Jesus, was the most acclaimed, or is the most acclaimed maker, but wasn't at all at the time of his life. He lived 1698 to just to the age of 46, so just about half of where Stradivarius lived. He worked in Cremona, right next to Stradivarius, and at some point it seems that he's gone missing for a bit, and it seems he might have knocked out a rival, as in murdered a rival, went to prison, and from there made some violins. The myth makers didn't want to deflate this myth, and so we have this notion of Del Gesù being like the Caravaggio, if you like, if Stradivarius is the Da Vinci of the violins. Stradivarius leaves us with about 650 surviving instruments, violins, and Guarneri leaves us only with about 110, and not many of them are really of this class. There's an asteroid named after him, 19185 Guarneri, discovered in 1991, and this indicates how stellar he's become. That's not a cute joke, because that won't be regarded as funny by my son. So 1743 died Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, last of the Medici, born in 1667, the last in the line of the great Florentine dynasty. Born Sir Joseph Banks, British naturalist and botanist. Born Spencer Compton, second Prime Minister of the UK. Born Thomas Jefferson, one of my all-time favourite people. The third president of the United States of America. Jefferson doubled the size of the United States during his presidency, drafted and signed into a law, a bill that banned slave importation into the United States. My son also said, don't speak too fast, but I will run out of time. And this is important. He was one of the first wine connoisseurs, and with Benjamin Franklin, planted some of the first vineyards in the United States of America. Incidentally, and I'm quoting, incidentally, it's not incidental at all, he played the violin and declared that music is the favorite passion of my soul, and fortune has cast my lot in a country where it is in a state of deplorable barbarism. How things have improved. And to improve the state of music in America, Jefferson encouraged its practice, and music played an important role in the life of his family through the generations. 1943 was also the year that this violin was made. It's now 272 years old, if my maths can be trusted. It's nicknamed the Caratus after the Victorian era violinist, John Strangely, named Tip Lady Caratus. And it was made by Bartolomeo Giuseppe Antonio Guarneri, nicknamed Del Gesù, of Jesus. It was made in Cremona, Italy. And if Stradivarius, as I say, was the Da Vinci, then this sure as hell is the Caravaggio, the deep, dark hue sound that comes out of this instrument, and these instruments is what sets them apart. He was an irascible genius, there's no doubt about it, and these violins are possibly even more highly sought after than those of Stradivarius. In the label, it's incorporated the nomina sacra, IHS, iota, eta, sigma, and a Roman cross. It's made from spruce at the top and maple at the bottom. This instrument, now in Australian soil, is owned, and on loan to me, is owned by an anonymous benefactor, and it's not Alan Jones. Paganini was 39 years from being born when this instrument was born, and one spine-tingling fact about this instrument is that it's carved out of the same trunk of tree as the most acclaimed violin on the planet, Il Canone, which was in a permanent exhibition in Genoa in Italy. It's considered feasible that this instrument, owned also by Paganini, was allegedly lost gambling. Well, we are in the Packer Auditorium after all, ladies and gentlemen. And So one very quick description of Paganini. His pale, long-drawn face with its hollow cheeks, his thin lips that seemed to curl into a sardonic smile, piercing expression of his eyes, which were like flaming charcoals, gave him a diabolic appearance. When he died, the church refused to allow him to be buried on holy ground. Diabolic was Paganini. I think it's time just for a couple of notes to indicate the sound that might have come out of this violin played by Paganini himself. Now, if I'm to continue on the lines of being licentious, according to the title, lawlessness, then I need to go to cars, don't I? Violins, violence, and cars. That's not funny, I know. But violins and cars, Ferrari. I can say violins and Ferrari. This is a wonderful fact. The first painting of a violin-like instrument is by Gaudenzio Ferrari, the Madonna of the Orange Tree in 1530. And a cherub plays a bowed instrument very similar to that of a violin. There are no frets, only 3 strings, but it really resembles that of a violin. The violin steadily acclaimed popularity on the street and in the royal houses. Aristocrats liked playing the violin. The first, possibly the inventor of the violin, was Andrea Amati, born in 1505. Now, the Australian Chamber Orchestra recently had another anonymous benefactor who was encouraged to buy a double bass. And the bass maker, Gaspar de Solo, was born in 1542. And for the wood to mature means that this wood might be 300 years old when the instrument was made in maybe 1600. So do your maths on the wood that we're transporting around the country. The birth of the violin, I think I've just got time to tell you that there's a lot of poetry associated with this. And one such thing, and it's worth quoting, is coming from the mind of Leopold Mozart, the father of Mozart. And he writes that the ancient name of chorded instruments of the lute, mandolin, and guitar kinds is the celli. Tradition has it that the Nile, having overflowed Egypt, left on shore a dead celli or a tortoise, the flesh of which being dried in the sun, nothing was left within the shell but nerves and cartilages, and these being braced and contracted were rendered sonorous. Mercury, in walking, struck his foot against the shell of the tortoise and was delighted with the sound produced, which gave him the idea of a lyre that he later constructed in the form of a tortoise and strung with the dried sinews of dead animals. This account of the origin of lutes, fiddles, and catgut is classic and picturesque, to quote somebody else. The DNA of the violin can be also traced to Islam, and Persian geographer, excuse my pronunciation, Kura Dadbi, who died in 911, was the first to cite the bowed Byzantine lyra as a typical instrument of the Byzantines and equivalent to the rababs used in the Islamic empires of that time. The Byzantine lyra, the lyre, spread through Europe westward, and in the 11th and 12th centuries, European writers used the terms fiddle and lyra interchangeably when referring to bowed instruments. Now let's skip forward to Cremona, where these wonderful, wonderful makers worked in the golden era of violin making. And to quote Roger Hargraves, an expert in this area, to contextualize, having changed masters many times at the onset of the 16th century, Milan finally fell to Spain in 1535. Milan remained under Spanish influence until the Wars of the Succession in the early 18th century. Throughout this time, the city of Cremona, where these great instrument makers were based, remained under jurisdiction of Milan. Coincidentally or otherwise, this period of Spanish rule largely concurred with the greatest period of Cremonese violin making. And I was trying to draw the bow, so to speak, as well back to Islam, because of course the Moors ruled Spain for 800 years, but the Habsburg had already already beaten the Moors and were ruling at the time of these great violins. But if we're to continue the licentious rule before I do a little test, then we have to turn to women. And when I say women, I mean in regard to men and what men do or don't do. Now, I always thought that this was a man's world, the violin world, during the 18th century. Recently, as in today, I found out that Del Jesu's wife had a hand to play in the crafting of these fine instruments, especially in the last few years of his life. This is a revelation to me. And the wife appears to be the only possible assistant to Del Jesu because Del Jesu was so poor, he couldn't afford any other assistants. And then when Del Jesu died, it seems that violins continued to come out of his workshop, and there are no other possibilities than the woman. I think this is a wonderful revelation to be celebrated. So the canon of 1743 and the caritas, it suggests a carver not fully comfortable with their tools, but creating something really individualistic. And this, for me, is very exciting. In the last few years of Guarneri del Jesu's life, and his wife's life, which should include, he made a series of instruments that have no rival, and I quote a violin expert here, for sheer originality and forceful execution, both visually and tonally. And ladies and gentlemen, this is one of them. I'm honored to hold it in my hands and always honored to play it. And I'm going to play it for you. But if we're allowed an extra 30 seconds, I'll play a cheaper violin and hope that you enjoy it even more, because then it means I could buy a cheap violin and it's better than this one. But to date, it's not the case. And also there's one reason why these instruments will always go for these great prices, and that's because every instrument that you see, every violin you see, is a copy of these great instruments. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Exhibit A. It's meant to be a blind test, but... So that's A. And then this, ladies and gentlemen, is B. You don't have to vote. My son wanted you to vote, but he's too young to know what it is. So look, shall I play a bit? Okay. So I'll just play. It's 2 minutes, so sorry for taking you over time. Sorry if... Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we all know that that's the language that Richard Tognetti truly speaks. I would just like to thank all of our speakers for being with us tonight. I just feel so fortunate to be here, and I hope you do too. It's been a terrific night with, and thanks to the festival team, Gemma, and everyone who's here at the Ros Packer, MJ, Lou, and crew. Thank you very much. The speakers will be available to sign their books up in the Ruth Cracknell room. And thank you so much for coming. I hope you've all enjoyed it.